Hello and welcome to the Klassiki Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary titles, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and much more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice, and remember you can always get in touch with us at podcast@klassiki.online. The forest is one of the prevailing symbols of Russia and its former imperial holdings, from the borderlands of Poland, Belarus and Ukraine, to the mountains of the Caucasus and the expanse of the Siberian taiga, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So how has the forest informed Russia's sense of itself and its place in the world? This is the question at the heart of Sophie Pinkham's new book, The Oak and The Larch, A Forest History of Russia and Its Empires. It's a cultural and environmental history about the role of the forest in making and resisting the Russian and Soviet states, drawing on literature and art as well as religious and political thought, and stretching from the Bronze Age to the war on Ukraine. Sophie is one of my favourite writers on Russian, Soviet and post-Soviet culture, and the book is a real treat, and it has plenty to say about cinema as well. So this week I invited her onto the pod to discuss the forest on film. How have filmmakers, Russian and otherwise, related to the forest? What do their films tell us about Russian and Soviet colonialism and environmentalism? And what about the ecocidal aspects of Russia's current war on Ukraine? We touched on all this, as well as pagans, geologists and partisans, with reference to some cinematic classics, including Andrei Tarkovsky, Akira Kurosawa and Larisa Shepitko. Check out Sophie's book, The Oak and The Larch, at the link in the show description. Sophie, welcome to the show.
Hello, Sam. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. I'm really excited to get into this book and to get into the forest, to escape into the forest, as the Russians would put it. And there's lots here about cinema, and we will get to cinema. But I thought it would be good for people who might be coming to the subject a little fresh to kind of start with some of the broader, questions or arguments about the book as a whole. So if it's not too broad an opening salvo, why use the forest as a way into Russian history and identity? And not just Russian.
Yeah. So it's important that it's not just Russian. It's
Right.
it's a book that's about, and I'm sure we'll get into this more when we talk about the films, but it's a book that is about the places that have been controlled at various times by Russia or by Moscow, right? In the case of the Soviet Union. Um, but I chose to write the book because I had been thinking originally about doing a book that was related to climate change in Russia and how climate change was changing Russia. And I ended up leaving that idea behind for various reasons. But as I was reflecting on it, I kept coming back to images of the forest that I remembered from different works of literature from Russia, from the Soviet Union, not necessarily Russian, but from Russia and the Soviet Union, and also films. And I began to realize that the forest was reappearing over and over again, not only in the expected places like Tolstoy or Turgenev, but also in quite surprising places often. And I was reflecting on how powerful a symbol the forest was as a stand-in for Russian identity and about why that might be. As I continued sort of dwelling on this idea of the forest, it also became clear to me that it was a sort of guiding motif in a more material way for Russia's history in terms of a place where they were taking refuge from the Mongols when the Mongols were invading, as a resource, of course, for all of their building materials, for honey, for berries. And it became clear to me as I kept digging into the subject that the forest really had sort of made Russia what it is today. And as the Soviet writer Leonid Leonov wrote in his book, The Russian Forest, somewhat on the nose as a title, um, the forest accompanied the Russian from the wood for his cradle to the cross over his grave. And that's sort of a quotation that I've returned to many times over the course of working on this book.
Yeah, I mean, Leonov's just one of many fascinating kind of cultural figures who you show to be really intertwined with the forest, and Leonov more than most. And maybe we can get to him later. I mean, you open with this statistic, which I've heard you use in other contexts, which I still can't believe, which is that Russia has more trees than there are stars in the galaxy. Is this true?
It is true. Many have challenged me on this statistic.
I'm not challenging. I'm just,
No,
I'm
no,
just, I'm in
I fact
disbelief.
checked it. Yes, it is true. It is
Okay.
indeed true. There are a lot of trees, and there are actually not that many stars in the galaxy. So, yeah, and I mean Russia also now, in its gravely diminished state, even now Russia has about a fifth of the world's tree
Yeah.
cover. I think that we don't spend enough time thinking about how large Russia is, just geographically, right?
I
If you
think
ever sort of
these
really
days,
ponder a map.
these days
Yeah.
people think a bit more about how and why it is so large. I think in the last couple of years, but
Mm.
yeah. So Russia is, like you say, it's 1/5 of the world's forest cover. It's these forests going from kind of the Baltic to the Pacific and into Central Asia, and it is this, like you say, this ubiquitous presence in literally geographically, but and symbolically. And the book is really kind of structured around these various kind of contradictory attitudes and behaviors of Russian and non-Russian people towards the forest. This kind of combination of respect and neglect and kind of affection and hostility that manifest in all sorts of ways. And that really kind of allows you to run this kind of gamut from centralizing imperial power to kind of dissidence and subversion and kind of the colonial or indigenous other and so on. And the two trees of the title, the oak and the larch, kind of speak to that, right? Could you just tell us briefly the kind of symbolic value of the oak versus or plus the larch?
Hmm. Yeah, of course. It may occur to many people that the birch tree is the one most
Yeah,
stereotypically associated with Russia, but that's more of a secondary tree, and partly because the book is so much about going into, the quite deep past, much farther into Russian history than I think most people tend to reflect these days. Um, they These are two very long-lived trees, and I use the oak as a stand-in for Western Russia, for kind of Central European Russia. The oak was in Russia, as in many other European societies, a symbol of righteousness, a symbol of justice, a very long-lived, majestic tree characteristic of temperate forests. And then I use the larch in part in a gesture to Shalamov's story, The Resurrection of the Larch, which is about the Gulag. I use the larch as a stand-in for the Siberian taiga, for the boreal forests, for the east of Russia, for the colder, much more inhospitable parts of the Russian forest. And that is also in keeping with Shalamov's story, which is about sort of survival and memory in the Gulag. I use the larch as a symbol of sort of endurance and of trees as beings that outlive humans, and that in some sense are able to sort of bear witness, and who also can give an example of sort of how to survive in an extraordinarily inhospitable climate, which is a big theme of the book as well.
yeah. On that question of on longevity, as you point out, many of the places. I mean, I've been careful to be saying Russian and non-Russian
Yeah.
people and places, but many of the places that you explore in the book were captured or seized or taken control of by Russia only in the last few centuries as part of a kind of Russian imperial project. And as you point out, that is within the lifetime of a not particularly old larch tree. So I think that's a
Mhm.
that's a nice example of the way that the forest or these trees open up this kind of perspective, this new perspective on that history.
Yes, absolutely. That was something that I really enjoyed thinking about. And of course, it's even more striking when you start thinking about kind of geological time.
Well, that can be your next book, the rocks, and that question of kind of imperial expansion or colonization is, as you kind of show, really bound up in these attitudes and behaviors towards the forest, because in places like the Caucasus, it was deforestation that allowed the kind of Russian Imperial Army to eventually kind of disperse and defeat these kind of forest-bound guerrillas and partisans in places like Chechnya and Dagestan.
Yes, in that case, the forest was an enemy, right? And so, as you mentioned, throughout the book, I'm exploring this duality and these tensions in the role of the forest. So, on one hand, for the Russians, for example, when the Mongols were invading, the forest was a crucial refuge, a hiding place, right? Much harder for the Mongols to conquer, but by that same token, when the Russians were trying to conquer a place here, the Caucasus, the forest was an essential refuge for local guerrillas. And in that particular case, actually, the sort of highlanders of that region, who are various ethnic groups, they managed to wage one of the most, or probably the most effective and successful guerrilla war of the entire 19th century. And one of their key resources there was the forest. So the process of conquest and, in fact, genocide was going hand in hand with what we would now call ecocide. So the systematic destruction of the forest there in order to destroy the hiding place of the guerrilla soldiers.
I mean, this question of new perspective, the necessity of new perspectives on these histories is something that obviously in the last couple of years, for obvious reasons, and we can talk about ecocide in the context of the war in Ukraine. For obvious reasons, this has become a much more urgent question for a lot of people, and yeah, like I think this book really convincingly argues that the forest is can be a vector, right, for opening up this kind of non-Russocentric, if you want to call it that, perspective. I presume you went in to this book with something like that in mind, but I mean, what were some of the ways maybe that were surprised to you that these perspectives opened up through your kind of journey through the forest?
Yeah. I actually learned Russian in Ukraine, and have spent more time proportionally living in Ukraine than I have in Russia. So I've always had a sort of outside of Russia, kind of more than Russia perspective on these matters and this sort of cultural and historical field. But my original research plan for this book, which I had conceived before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, was a little bit more traditional, I would say. I was always planning to, include the non-Russian sort of lands that have been in the Russian Empire. But because of the full-scale invasion, I ended up doing much more of my research on sort of the outskirts of Russia.
Yeah.
So in Finland, for example, I spent time doing research in Finnish Karelia, like right across the border from Russian Karelia. I spent some time in Tusheti. I spent time in Białowieża Forest in Poland, which is now on the border of Belarus, but of course was once in the Soviet Union, or under Soviet control. And I also spent time in Mongolia. And so I think that really sharpened and intensified my understanding of the specific importance of border forests. And then that helped inform, for example, my understanding of the strategic importance of the forests in Palesia during the Second World War. So Palesia is in sort of northern, northwestern Ukraine, and in Belarus. And it's this very swampy forest that's very hard to conquer. But thinking about border forests in particular, I think was also a good way to balance out the stereotype of the sort of almost unknowable, ungraspable vastness of especially the Siberian forests,
Yeah.
right? Which historically and even today are seen as sort of unfathomably large. The border forests are something that is that are easier in a way to sort of wrap your mind around, and that also, I think, bring into high relief the function of the forest, both sort of historically, practically, militarily, but then also mythologically and metaphorically, the forest as a threshold
Mm.
space.
One of the, I'm trying to very professionally kind of segue towards a kind of more cinematic line of questioning. And one of the things that I really love about the book, and I think it's kind of in keeping with your writing more broadly, is the way that you work in this kind of literary history. And the book kind of demonstrates that demonstrates the importance of the forest and of the relationship to the forest for a range of very canonical writers, Turgenev, Tolstoy, Pushkin, Lermontov, and for instance, we're just mentioning the deforestation in the Caucasus. It's very actually very moving the your chapter on Tolstoy, because Tolstoy participated as a member of the Russian army in that deforestation, and then was basically haunted by it for the rest of his life. And I think you show quite convincingly that a lot of the things we associate with kind of old man Tolstoy, of the vegetarianism and the pacifism and the going to seed on his on his giant estate, can kind of be traced back to this kind of traumatic experience of taking part in deforestation.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, that was something that I wasn't necessarily expecting to find. Of course, I was aware of Tolstoy's very strong sort of ecological leanings, but I think that studying his experiences in the Caucasus, his time in the Caucasus, and his early writings that came, or well, his early and also very late writing, Haji Murat, that came out of that really really help us understand on a sort of biographical, historical, and visceral level the reasons, for example, that Tolstoy started to adopt these really still quite radical attitudes towards animals and plants as beings that whose lives were as valuable or could be understood in the same terms as those of humans. But you see that these weren't abstract kind of philosophical positions for
Mm.
him, that they were deeply rooted in things that he had seen and in his understanding of the ways in which genocide and ecocide were closely linked in the Caucasus.
Yeah. I said I was gonna get us onto cinema, and I will now by kind of extending that question. And I'm not sure if there is an easy answer to this, but if it is the case that the relationship of these writers to the forest can help us kind of trace some of these ideas across Russian history, Russian geography, then can we say the same for filmmakers and for filmmakers' relationships to the forest?
I mean, I think absolutely. And probably Tarkovsky is one of the most kind of shining and striking examples of this. He, in his early life, as I discussed in the Oak and the Larch, he, in his sort of early days after he dropped out of the Institute for Oriental Studies, where he was studying Arabic, he kind of joined this almost counterculture in the 1950s. And it was a counterculture of becoming a geologist or a
Mm.
prospector and kind of going out into the remotest parts of the Soviet Union to look for precious metals. It was also, of course, a way of making money. Some people could even become, quite rich and definitely very famous by finding this. But it was seen as, in the words of one historian, a kind of tiny island of freedom or archipelago of freedom in these parks. And so he went to the taiga, to a very remote part of the taiga near Turukhansk in Krasnoyarsk province, and was working as a geologist. And it was actually during his time in the taiga that he decided that he wanted to study film, apparently. And he well, he claimed to, I don't know to what extent it was his imagination, but he claimed to have this sort of semi-supernatural experience of being warned by some kind of like forest spirit to flee from a house before a tree crashed down on it, if I remember the story correctly. But, trees are obviously one of the
Yeah.
most important symbols in Tarkovsky. I mean, he's, among other things, one of the greatest kind of tree uh, tree filmers of all time, right? And Tarkovsky was exploring sort of the trees of many different regions, right? So in Andrei Rublev, we have the sort of intermittent trees of central Russia. One of my favorite parts of that movie is the bit where Andrei Rublev sort of stumbles upon the pagans and the
Right. Yeah.
beautiful naked lady who's in the river during this ritual and kind of seduces him. And that's a very kind of poetic, very beautiful and sort of florid example of the forest as a repository of sort of pagan beliefs, of pre-Christian rituals. And then in Ivan's childhood, or rather before that, in Ivan's childhood, you had the very swampy forests of Polesia and of sort of the border regions, which were, of course, incredibly important for the partisans, right?
Yeah.
These trees that are submerged, and there's that beautiful scene where Ivan and the other partisans are kind of wading through this submerged forest.
I think I was obviously thinking back to these kind of classic Tarkovsky films, especially Ivan's childhood and Andrei Rublev. I mean, there are trees in every Tarkovsky. Even his
Mhm.
sci-fi films have plentiful foliage in them. And I was thinking about, what the function there is. I mean, you've already mentioned that meeting of kind of Christianity and paganism in Andrei Rublev. And I think there's something people always refer to Tarkovsky as a spiritual filmmaker. And I've never really gone along with that description, except in this kind of animist sense. And that's where the forest comes in. Like, I don't really take him to be a Christian filmmaker per se, even though, Andrei Rublev is literally about an icon painter. But
Mhm.
his treatment of the forest or of the tree is so striking that it speaks to a kind of relationship that I think you can definitely describe in spiritual terms.
For me personally, watching Andrei Rublev over and over and over, I often feel that there's more sympathy with the animist side than with the Christian side. I don't know if it's my own prejudices, but he certainly doesn't seem like a kind of rigid and dogmatic Christian filmmaker to me by any means. I would think also of that shot that is through he's inside the church, and then through the door of the church, you see kind of this little tree growing, which is another really, really eloquent example of this tension that he's creating, I think, between the animist past, or, for Andrei Rublev, to a large extent, the animist present, um, and then the new sort of Christian reality. But the Christianity is sort of enclosed by walls, right? And for that reason, seems in some ways to receive less sympathy, I would say, in the film than the outside world, which is treated much more with a much more kind of lavish, joyful approach, right? The trees and water get more visual love, I would say, in Andrei Rublev
Yeah.
than churches do.
And I guess kind of conversely in Ivan's childhood, which is really a kind of it's a vision of a world that's already dead. It's already destroyed. I mean, the child Ivan is kind of dead before he actually physically dies at the hands of the Nazis. He's a kind of a ghost haunting his own life, and
Mhm.
it's Tarkovsky's vision of a world that's been kind of denatured or destroyed by war, and so the you can see that in the way that the forest in that film is this expressionistic, crooked, kind of sharp, encroaching space. I mean, obviously, it kind of protects and hides the partisans, but there's so many shots in it. Like you mentioned, the shots where they're wading through the this kind of swampy forest at night, which are They're like a horror film, really. I mean,
Mhm.
they're deeply disturbing, I find.
Yeah, and I mean the images of the kind of charred, burnt
Yeah.
trees without any kind of softness of leaves left, very spiky, like skeletons, like
Yeah, that's
ghosts.
the
Yeah,
word. Yeah. It's
sort of
good.
scary underworld.
I mean, we mentioned Tarkovsky going on this geological expedition, and like the figure of the geologist in the post-war Soviet Union is very interesting, unique one. Could you just fill people in who might not be aware about the kind of romantic cult of the geologist and what it represented in Soviet culture in the kind of 60s?
Yeah, I mean, I think because, well, the geologists were the explorers of the 1960s. As I mentioned, geological expeditions could also, as well as other sort of expeditions into the deep forest, into the sort of wilder parts of nature, were associated with a degree of liberation from all of the strictures and restraints of urban life, of course, the political restraints that were particularly heavy in the Soviet Union, and so on. There was a sort of feeling of loss of hierarchy, right? Everyone's around a campfire. Actually, there was actually hierarchy among geologists. But so this sort of romantic, wild freedom was very exciting to a lot of people in the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 60s. And of course, it was a real adventure. It was very dangerous to go into the taiga. People didn't survive. There were a lot of near escapes. And of course, there was sort of the prospect of finding gold, finding diamonds, finding other precious metals. And the geologists, it's interesting because the geologists were celebrated often in the same breath with the cosmonauts.
Mm,
So they were the people who were, mapping uncharted territory, sort of finding riches, bringing glory to the Soviet Union. Oftentimes, they were looking for diamonds that were going to be used for advanced scientific materials. So the geologists were very strongly, like the cosmonauts, associated with scientific advancement of the Soviet Union sort of for its own benefit, but also for its prestige and
yeah.
glory on the world stage. So geologists became celebrities in the Soviet Union.
So, I mean, the greatest example of this on film, I would say, maybe you'll disagree, is this film by Mikhail Kalatozov, Letter Never Sent. And people, if they're aware of Kalatozov, will probably be aware of the film he made before this, The Cranes Are Flying, wonderful World War II melodrama, which won the Palme d'Or and made a huge star of its lead actress Tatiana Samoylova, and put Kalatozov on top of the Soviet film industry. And he could have done anything, I think, really at that point. And that what he chose to do was to make Letter Never Sent, which is a film about an ill-fated geological expedition in the taiga, and which is, I believe, it's based on one of these true stories.
Yes, it was based on a true story.
I mean, what's your angle on this? If Tarkovsky has this spiritual, borderline animist relationship to the forest, the what's the underlying relationship that you read in Kalatozov in Letter Never Sent? Because it's an unbelievably beautiful, visually poetic, electric film
Mhm.
about how the tiger is going to kill you.
Yes, yes. The taiga is definitely going to kill you. I mean, I also think it must have been an extremely important influence on Tarkovsky. And I think that people who are more familiar with Tarkovsky than with Kalatozov, and of course, there's, the connection of the cinematographer or the importance of the cinematographer, Urusevsky.
Mm,
But the influence of the cinematography, I think, is very, very obvious on Tarkovsky. It must have been an important influence. But it's overwhelmingly, ravishingly beautiful and extremely scary, right? I
mm,
think it captures really perfectly the idea, yeah, that the taiga is going to kill you, the forest is trying to murder you. You may not escape with your life. But it's also, the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. And as in Tarkovsky, I think the interaction of the almost infinitely large forest and the sparkling rivers creates this just absolutely sublime visual landscape. But is Kalatozov an animist? I mean, the conquest of Siberia and especially geological prospecting in Siberia was associated with this idea that, Siberia had been politically conquered by Russia, so it was clearly, Russian Soviet territory, but that it was this treasure chest that had not yet been unlocked. That was one big metaphor. It was a sleeping beauty that had not yet been awakened and needed the kiss of geologists to wake it up and make it give up its diamonds. So I think that there's this fairy tale element to that story that Kalatozov does exploit very effectively in Letter Never Sent. That, when you go into the forest and you open the treasure box, what usually happens in a fairy tale, right? Usually you also kind of awaken some monster or anger a witch or something like that, or
Mm.
offend a wizard who then chases you out of the forest trying to kill you, right? And I think that that's one possible reading of Letter Never Sent. They discover the diamonds, they're so excited, but then they are sort of engulfed and destroyed. Letter Never Sent is one of the many examples, and Shepitko's films are also in this category of filmmaking that almost kills you, right?
Yeah.
So they made a real forest fire in sort of the grand Soviet tradition. We're really going to drown a village for our film about the hydroelectric dam. We're really going to start a forest fire in the taiga. These methods are no longer legal,
For some
but
reason.
yeah, for some reason. But they started a real fire, so they also were almost killed, right? And the actors wrote about how harrowing, how terrifying the process of filming was for them. But yeah, it's a really extraordinary cinematographic bringing to life of the sublime danger of the taiga, I would say.
I mean, you used the word sublime. Is this what Soviet romanticism is? Is this what the Soviet romantic looks like? Is something like this vision of the tiger?
Well, yeah, I mean, in some ways, that's sort of the basic meaning of the sublime, right? A beautiful thing that may kill you.
Yeah.
We've sort of neutralized the word sublime, but it's meant to be really quite scary. Sort of on the precipice of life and death, removed from the safety of everyday life. Of course, as I write about, this is also a very important trope for the Caucasus, right?
Mm.
You are sort of that romantic figure, standing on the edge of a cliff, with the wind blowing your hair, looking out on the mountains, but you better not trip.
Right. Yeah. And of course, as we keep saying, that goes back to an idea of taming the wilderness and the romantic hero
Hmm.
who tames the wilderness. I guess related to a film like Letter Never Sent. Letter Never Sent is all of the geologists there are white ethnic Russians, unless I'm kind of erasing some non-Russian white Slavic identity. But there are also films that deal explicitly with the encounter and the relationship between the kind of colonial Russian apparatus and state and the indigenous population. And like the most famous example here, which you talk about in the book, you talk about the book that the film is based on as well, is Dersu Uzala, which is not by a Soviet filmmaker, but was produced in the Soviet Union by Akira Kurosawa, which is about another a real life person, a real life character. It's about a real life trapper and nomadic kind of hunter called Dersu Uzala, who befriended and kind of worked with and helped a Russian kind of surveyor and engineer called Arsenyev in the early 20th century. What's the kind of elevator pitch for Dersu Uzala and on what it the role it plays in your story about this kind of encounter between the Russian and the indigenous forest dweller?
Well, Der Zula is, first of all, an incredibly great film. But also even in its book version. So to give a little bit of background, Arseniev was a naturalist. He was a very important naturalist who documented this whole ecosystem shortly before it disappeared in the form that it then existed in. And he was surveying the Far East of
Yes, I should
Russia
say this is the
in
Far
order,
East now, like the
yeah.
quasi, not tropical, but kind of humid, verdant, kind of Pacific end of Russia.
Yeah, so very close to Japan, to Korea. And he was serving it in order to help finish the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was, of course, a very important infrastructural project for the late empire. So he was surveying, but he was also documenting everything that he found. And he wrote I believe, two volume book about his travels. But what everyone latched onto was not his extremely detailed descriptions of all of the flora and fauna, but the story of his indigenous guide, Dersu Uzala, who became a very important and influential figure in the imagination of many generations of Russian and Soviet people who were exploring the wilderness, going into the wilderness, or just fantasizing about going into the wilderness, which was an increasingly popular pursuit as things got worse and worse in the Soviet Union. Um, but Dersu Uzala himself, or the idea of Dersu Uzala, was heavily influenced actually by the books of James Fenimore Cooper.
Right,
Um,
yes.
I don't know how well known he is in the UK. He's not that well known anymore in the US either, but was extremely popular for a while as the author of these sort of highly romanticized tales about often the lone kind of noble Indian who would help the European colonizers survive in the Indian Wars and
This
sort of
is
uptaking
Last
it.
of the Mohicans, that,
Yeah, Last of
right.
the Mohicans, film with Daniel Day-Lewis. That's probably why it's most famous now. So he wrote The Last of the Mohicans, and it's these adventure stories that feature a sort of noble, last of his kind native who is friendly and helpful, but who is also clearly kind of doomed for extinction. And so these narratives are ways of celebrating the kind of quote unquote good Indian, while also making it seem that the extinction of native peoples in these colonized places is inevitable. It's sort of almost a process of natural evolution rather than the product of intentional violence and extermination. So these James Fenimore Cooper books were very popular and influential in Russia as around the world, and they were one of the main inspirations for Dersu Uzala. But I mean, there are many things that are fascinating about this. It was in terms of the film, it's very interesting that it was made by a Japanese filmmaker, right? And
Mm.
apparently Kurosawa was he really loved the book Dersu Uzala, so it traveled abroad. It was translated early on. It traveled around the world. He was very attracted to this story, but felt that he could only film it if he was able to do it on site. So in the actual Far Eastern forest, he felt that the forest landscape was so important that it was impossible for him to recreate the story on any other set or in any other forest. And so he waited until he was able, until conditions in the Soviet Union were such that he was able to make a deal with Mosfilm to make Dersu Uzala. But one of the many things that I find interesting about Dersu is the way that in the book and also in the movie, the protagonist Arseniev, he almost seems to be in love with Dersu and there's this
Yeah.
very kind of romantic, I wouldn't say erotic, but it's definitely a romantic tinge to the whole story. He loves Dersu They like snuggle up together to survive the snowstorm. Obviously, it's about body heat and body warmth. Um, but Dersu at times takes on this sort of half motherly, sort of half romantic, sort of caretaker role for Arseniev. Arseniev kind of becomes like, is he like a little baby, or is Dersu the affectionate, caring lover who's protecting him, and so on. Arseniev's survival is dependent on Dersu over and over again, but he misses Dersu when he's gone. Like he longs for him. There's a lot of that in the book. But of course, Dersuuzela, spoiler alert, dies in the end. He's sort of a casualty of modernization, and that loss of Dersuuzela is intensely mourned in the book and also in the film, but also seems to be inevitable. So you see how Arseniev has depended on Dersu Uzala for the guidance that allows him to complete his task. He becomes deeply attached to him emotionally, but he has also brought about his doom, as well as the doom of a lot of the ecosystems that he's documenting. So there's this a sort of almost paradoxical
Yeah.
relationship between exploration and destruction.
I mean, the other canonical filmmaker who I do think we need to talk about before we finish is whose career is very bound up with forests is Larisa Shepitko, and also her husband Elem Klimov as well,
Mm.
relatedly. Um,
He's just Mr. Shapiro to us.
Mr.
He's just
Yeah,
Mr. Shapiro to us.
is there a Mr. Shepitko? There was, yeah, and he was all right. So yeah, Shepitko. Oh, there's so much to say about Shepitko, how she relates to a lot of these kind of intellectual cultural trends that you're talking about in the book about Soviet ecology and Soviet environmentalism and so on. In her adaptations of writers like Platonov, who were deeply interested in this question of the kind of genus of the landscape and so on. But for pure kind of literal tree goodness on screen, with Shapika, we have to talk about The Ascent, her classic partisan war film from 1977, which takes us from, we've been in the Far East there with Desi Uzada, now we're jumping as far as we can possibly go to the kind of western borders of the Soviet Union, to this region, Palesia, which you mentioned briefly before, which is the kind of swampier forest region of Ukraine and Belarus, which was a huge center of partisan activity in the Second World War, precisely because it was this unnavigable, difficult to traverse, difficult to survey space that provided for partisan warfare. So yeah, Shapiko and the forest. I mean, there's some tree shots in The Ascent which I think rival anything in Tarkovsky, in Ivan's Childhood, or Andrei Rublev.
Absolutely. Absolutely. For me, and this is one of the most famous shots, but one of the most indelible images in the film is certainly the one where the injured partisan, um, gosh, what is his name? I'm blanking on
Sotnikov.
his name. Not Rybak, yeah, Sotnikov. Where Sotnikov is sort of lying against the tree, but you're seeing him through the frost-rimed branches, and he's sort of underneath them, this palimpsest. And then there's the bit where he actually is stuck to the frozen tree. You feel his kind of life force going out of him. And it's significant that the other character, the sort of ignorant and ultimately not very morally upright, sort of peasant type Rybak, that his name, which comes from the word for fish or fisherman, his name associates him with the river rather than the forest. But yeah, Shepitko has so many images of incredibly frightening and unforgiving landscapes, right? Especially in Central Asia, in her first feature film, Heat. And then in the short she made, The Motherland of Electricity, which is set during a very severe drought in a sort of very backwards place. But by contrast, the forest in her films is a place of safety. In the first shot, it's also, well, every shot in the Ascent really is extraordinary. But in the first shot, which I love so much, you just see this white expanse, and it takes a minute for you to even realize what it is. That it's just this completely snow-colored field, and then you see these small black figures sort of pop up like badgers or something, and they're these
Mm.
these partisans. But it makes you think immediately about how vulnerable they are when they're on these treeless expanses, right? So for the partisans, the trees were completely essential to survival, really, because they protected them from view. And interestingly, that is something that is relevant today, actually, in the war in Ukraine, in relation to drones. And that's something that you can think about quite productively as well as painfully when watching Shepitko's films or Adam Klimov's Come and See, which deals with the same theme of partisans hiding in the forest. Um, but you see how people kind of blend into the forest. And I think there is this sort of, like Tarkovsky, I mean, she has this interesting tension between the Christian thread and then maybe a slightly animist tendency. But you see throughout the film how, thanks in part to the way that the cinematography works, people are sort of blending into trees in a way that's impossible when they are in a more exposed landscape.
Yeah, I think with Shapiko, I mean, I guess apart from her film Wings, which is kind of an urban drama, it's set in Sevastopol, Crimea. All her, all the films she managed to make before she was kind of tragically killed far too young, are all about environments and like extreme environments. The heat of the steppe in Central Asia, the kind of parched, drought-ridden land in central Russia, in the homeland of electricity, and then this deep winter swamp forest in the ascent. And all of these landscapes for her always provide these testing grounds, spiritual testing grounds for the mortification of her characters, and a chance for them to prove whether they are worthy of survival or of kind of celebration, vindication. And it is interesting that Shapitko Klimov marriage produced two classic films about Belarusian partisans
Mhm.
in the Second World War.
Well, one sort of tidbit that I came across while I was working on the Oak and the Larch is that here again, with the filming of The Ascent, was another sort of incredible example of I don't know, what would you call it, Soviet method acting, where the extras in the film committed along with the main actors to be sort of as exposed to the extreme temperatures as the actual partisans had been, because a lot of them had family members who were partisans, right? And the extras decided that they didn't want to, warm up in the time between shoots. So Larisa Shepitko noticed that even some of the children, like their fingers were black from frostbite during the shooting period. But it was this process of mortification of the flesh literally for the actors,
Yeah.
as well as for the characters within the narrative. And so here we really see on both of those levels the idea of almost sort of a crucifixion in by nature as well as by Nazis, right? And you see the role of the forest as this place of sacrifice, of near death, of sort of ritual cleansing, that I think absolutely goes back to these pre-Christian ways of relating to the forest.
Yeah, and Shapika, I mean, the film that Shapika was working on when she was killed in a car crash whilst she was location scouting for a film that she had begun filming on called Farewell, which is an adaptation of a story by Valentin Rasputin, who is the central figure in this literary movement in the Soviet Union called the Village Prose movement, which is, I mean, we don't have time to get into the reads of that one, but which is was this movement which kind of, I'm not sure what verb to use. I did say champion, but kind of lamented the loss of traditional Russian rural life to the kind of Soviet Union's modernization drives, and was bound up with a lot of, I think, quite problematic nationalistic sentiments, but which was nonetheless a kind of very interesting example of the ways that Soviet culture did produce this back and forth between its various kind of tendencies. And so this film Farewell that Shapika was working on when she died, and that Klimov, her husband, would go on to kind of finish in her honor, is about an island, a village on an island in a lake that is going to be flooded due to the construction of a new hydroelectric dam. And that's another great trees and forest film, and it's really interesting as a kind of blend of Shapiko and Klimov's sensibilities And there is a kind of central tree in that film, which is a larch, I believe, right? It is a
Yeah, the Tsar larch. Yeah,
that's
which is
yeah.
another reason that I chose the larch as one of the trees in my book title is because of the Tsar larch in Valentin Rasputin's original novel, which I discuss at some length. Yeah, the Tsar larch.
Which is like this tree in the middle of the island, and the idea is that it's kind of it's the plug holding the island in the lake, and if you remove it, then everyone will perish. And it's this tree that the Soviets can't knock down. They try burning it down, they try chopping it down, and it survives even after they flood the island as this symbol of kind of resilience, but also of loss and of environmental kind of destruction.
Yes, and the shot of that tree was, I believe, the last shot that Larisa Shepitko ever made before she died. Um,
Yes, I believe
yeah, that was
that's
her
right.
last cadre.
And I guess I hopefully this doesn't seem too tacked on at the end, but just to kind of bring us to the present day and the kind of present context of these territories that we've been talking about. I mean, you point out throughout the book the various ways in which this kind of respect or affection for the forest has shaded into or been kind of appropriated by nationalistic, xenophobic, centralizing arguments and forces. You know, the forest is a symbol of a kind of Russia that has to be kind of purified and preserved. And one thing that you mentioned in the book, just to kind of bring it full circle, which I wasn't really aware of, is that Tarkovsky's nephew, Mikhail Tarkovsky, is now has was also a kind of filmmaker artist himself, and who's now been kind of like looped into and become an active participant in this kind of new Putinist, nationalistic, anti-Ukrainian culture. Could you just tell us a little bit about how Tarkovsky Jr. has via the forest has now ended up on the kind of the wrong side of history?
Yeah, it's kind of a gory tale of the degeneration of the the Moscow intellectual artistic elite. So Mikhail Tarkovsky is Andrei's nephew, and he abandoned his life in the metropole and went to live in an incredibly remote part of Siberia. Actually, not that far by Siberian standards, at least, not that far from where Andrei Tarkovsky spent time in the taiga when he was on his geological expedition. Um, but Mikhail Tarkovsky went there and started working as a professional hunter, basically. But he also, being Mikhail Tarkovsky's nephew, made a reality show, basically, about his life in the wilderness, which was later edited and made into a film by Werner Herzog, actually, called Happy People, with
Hmm.
an affable Herzogian touch. And you can see why that story appeals to Werner Herzog. But Mikhail Tarkovsky made this mini series, Happy People, which you can watch on YouTube, actually. And he is a very enthusiastic nationalist of the kind of back to the land variety. He's also very Orthodox Christian, very involved with the rebuilding or the building of traditional wooden churches, which is a big theme in Russian nationalism, and is a great example of the type of person who sees the sort of colonized space of Siberia as actually the most beautiful, powerful, and politically significant testament to kind of Russian identity, Russian nationalism, the Russian soul. And in keeping with that imperial tendency, he is also a big supporter of the war in Ukraine and actually went to the front in Donbass, visited his friend Zakhar Prilepin, another writer who has turned his hand to war in recent years. Painfully, actually, Zakhar Prilepin was publicizing this visit of Mikhail Tarkovsky to the front, partly in association with his uncle, right? And was saying, oh, the treasures of Russian culture are now coming to the fight in Donbass, right? So he portrayed Mikhail Tarkovsky as a bearer of Andrei Tarkovsky's legacy.
And I mean, this is without even getting into the question of ecocide as part of the war in Ukraine, and the role of forests, as you kind of touched on before, in the kind of execution of the war itself. But I think that's a topic that would kind of deserve its own discussion. I mean, there is already a kind of cinema of Ukrainian ecocide. There's a fantastic documentary from, I think, last year or 2 years ago, called Silent Flood by Dmitry Sobchuk, which is about the kind of aftermath of the Kakhovka Dam destruction.
Oh.
Speaking of flooding and hydroelectric dams. So yeah, I mean, that's potentially the subject for future discussion, future books even.
Yeah, there are a couple of quite powerful documentaries about the forest and the war as well.
Well, that will have to wait for your next book, I think. But I think we'd best leave it there for today. Sophie Pinkham, thanks so much for guiding us through the forest and for joining us today.
Thank you, Sam. It was a pleasure talking to you.